12th class and the topic is lethal gene. So today we are going to know about what are lethal genes and how many types are there for lethal genes and what is their actual impact upon one's individuality. Class is for 12th zoology. So lethal gene, we may try to define actually what a lethal gene is. As I have already told you students that lethal means destructive, dangerous, which can have an adverse, rather lethal effect, tough effect which can take one's life. So that is why the word lethal has been used before the gene. So by name lethal gene we clearly get the indication that any gene which have a lethal phenotypic effect upon a person, upon an individual, that is known as a lethal gene, and which may make one's death, which may kill that individual. So a lethal gene can be defined as a gene whose phenotypic effect is so defective or abnormal to kill the individual. Any gene which is present inside an individual, and when present inside an individual, its phenotypic effect is so drastic, it is so defective, it is so abnormal, it is so lethal that its impact kills that individual. He doesn't survive, he or she doesn't survive. So this is lethal gene. So any destructive type of gene present in any individual which can kill that very individual, and that gene is known as lethal gene. So now we will see what are the types of lethal genes, how many types are there for lethal genes. So number one type is dominant lethal gene. As you clearly know from the name that it is dominant, that both the genes are dominating for the lethalic nature, for the destructive nature. So when we are going to define the dominant lethal genes, we may say that these are the genes which are lethal in homozygous condition. When they are present in homozygous condition, homozygous means when both the genes present in an individual are lethal, when they are dominant lethal, when both are responsible for lethality, when both are responsible for destructive nature, when both are responsible for abnormality. So at that time the individual gets killed, it doesn't survive, it remains very lethal at that time for the individual. When both the genes are in homozygous condition, that when both the genes are lethal at the same time and their phenotypic effect kills that individual. But if these genes are not dominant, suppose they are dominant, but if they are in heterozygous condition, not in homozygous condition, one is lethal and other is not lethal. So when they are heterozygous condition, present in heterozygous condition, at that time the individual may not die out, but he may show some defective or abnormal phenotypic effect. At a time he will survive, he may not get killed, but he shows defective or abnormal nature. So dominant lethal gene may be present in two conditions, one in homozygous condition and other in heterozygous. Homozygous condition is when both the genes are lethal, and heterozygous condition is when one dominant gene is for lethalic nature and other dominant gene is non-lethalic nature, and at that time the individual may not die, it will live but with abnormality, but with defective nature. A character is attached with dominant lethal genes that they don't pass to next generation. Here one thing you have to remember, suppose any individual or any person is possessing lethal genes, dominant lethal genes, and this lethalic nature, it may not pass from this generation to the next one, from this individual to the next one, because The individual or person which is bearing this, or organism which is bearing this dominant lethal gene, he may not live, he get died out. When he die out, he may not continue this lethal gene to the coming generation. So this is the main aspect here. We should remember that any dominant lethal gene present in any individual or organism, it may not go to the next generation because the bearing individual dies out at the same generation. These genes were firstly discovered by Cunot in 1905. You had to remember this, that these lethal genes, they were discovered by a scientist whose name was Cunot in 1905. And there are some conditions where we may see dominant lethal genes, and those conditions are, you can write in the exam up to this stage also what dominant lethal genes are. But if any of your any of the student among you, it may enhance the answer, he may continue and he may write that there are certain diseases, such as there is a disease in the color of mouse body. There is next disease that is known as brachyphalangy, where short fingers are present in humans. There is a disease which is known as sickle cell anemia. I have already told about you what sickle cell anemia is. These are the diseases which are present in a person in dominant nature as well as in homozygous nature. These are lethal genes which may be present in homozygous nature as well as in heterozygous nature. If present in homozygous, the person dies out. If present in heterozygous, the person shows abnormality but it lives. And similarly, there is one more disease which is known as Huntington's chorea or Huntington's disease. So Huntington's chorea or Huntington's disease, Huntington was actually a doctor, and in 1872 he found out a disease that a person may suffer from brain disorder. The nerve cells in a person, they may get degenerated out, and there may occur muscular failure and mental retardation and finally death. And the next type of genes, lethal genes, is recessive lethal genes. So recessive lethal genes, the recessive lethal genes produce lethal effect only in homozygous condition. When recessive lethal genes, they are both in homozygous condition, that means if both recessive genes are lethal, then they show some abnormal effect. They will not kill the person or organism, but they will show an abnormal effect. But if these lethal genes are in heterozygous condition, the person or individual, it is normal, but it becomes a carrier, that is, it carries this gene to next generation. So when these recessive lethal genes are present in homozygous, means both the genes, they are recessive, not dominant, but they have lethal nature, then it shows some abnormality. But if they are in heterozygous, that one recessive gene is normal and one recessive gene is lethal, at that time the person does not have any problem with it. Is phenotypic effect is normal, but it may become a carrier. An example for recessive lethal gene is Tay-Sachs disease, where there occurs the accumulation of fat in nerve sheaths, which finally lead to mental deficiency and poor muscular control. There may occur poor muscular control. The person suffering from Tay-Sachs disease doesn't have a good muscular control and have a retarded mental problem, because there occurs the accumulation, the deposition of fat in nerve sheaths. And finally, the third type is conditional lethal gene. So conditional lethal genes are actually these genes which are normal in one environment but abnormal in another environment. Which are normal for the individual in one environment, but they are lethal for the same individual in another environment. So that is why they are known as conditional lethal genes. So example for this is, suppose it has been observed in poultry, in chicken, that a recessive gene make feeders of poultry to break down. Suppose there are poultry birds and they may possess recessive genes which are responsible for conditional lethal genes, and those poultry birds, they start to shut down their feeders start to break down, and when their chicks came, if these genes are homozygous, that both these conditional lethal genes are present for this effect, and then the chicks, they are feederless, they don't have any feeders upon their body, and these chicks, if they were reared in a warm environment, in a good environment where there is warm temperature, where there is good room temperature, they may survive. But if these same chicks or feederless chicks are being put in a cold atmosphere, in a cold environment, they don't survive there because they cannot tolerate the coldness, the effect of coldness due to the absence of feeders. So in warm environment they may live, but in cold environment they die out. That is why I say already you that conditional lethal genes, when present in any individual or organism, they show normal behavior in one environment but lethal behavior in another environment. So this was today's topic for class 12th, genetics, lethal genes and its types, for class 12th higher secondary Zachildara. Hope students you would have understood this topic very well. For any query, please do contact me. Thank you. Have a good day.